Welcome to the Kennedy School. Welcome to the Belfer Center. I'm Nick Burns, professor here at the Kennedy School. It's a pleasure to see so many friends and so many faculty members. I'm looking at Professor Erica Chenoweth right in the middle of my screen and others. Thank you all for being here. This is going to be a really fun and I think very important conversation. It's a conversation entitled Out of Many, One, the Refugee and Immigrant Stories of Madeleine K. Albright, Dina Powell McCormick, and Ezinne Uzo-Okoro. It's a conversation that centers around one of the defining features of America and of the American people. We're a nation of immigrants, as all of us know. We are a nation of refugees. We come from every continent and every country. We embody all the world's religions, all the world's races, all the world's ethnicities. Think of the American story that all of us have lived with, that we learned about as kids. The story of the immigrant fleeing the lack of opportunity, fleeing prejudice, fleeing poverty. The story of the refugee fleeing persecution. We'll talk about that today. Immigration and refugee admission are also, in a way, etched into our genetic code. We're a multi-ethnic, multi-religious, multiracial country. It's an enormous strength of the United States. If you think of it, it defines the fact that we're an inclusive democracy, not an exclusive one. In geopolitical terms, at a time when China, Japan, the Republic of Korea, Russia, and nearly every European countries are suffering a demographic crisis, their population rates are falling, the United States is staying even, and we may, with enlightened immigrant and refugee policies in the next 4 years, actually race ahead. We're the second youngest of all the great economic powers in the world, second only to India, not because our birth rate is higher than that of China or Russia or Germany, but because we take in and have since the Immigration and Nationality Act of 1965, a lot of immigrants and a lot of refugees every year. This conversation today was inspired by a remarkable book. And the book is this book out of, I guess you can't see it, maybe because of my background. And the book is entitled Out of Many, One, Portraits of America's Immigrants by President George W. Bush. It is an extraordinary book in two respects. He tells the stories, the portraits, of 43 immigrants from 35 countries. But what makes the book especially unique and really quite remarkable is the fact that he actually paints the photo, paints the portraits of each of these 43 people. The book is compelling, and I think it's testimony to what Dina and I know well, because both of us worked for President George W. Bush. He is a person of great faith and of great humanity. He has been a persistent and consistent advocate for immigration reform and for an inclusive America. And he says in the preface to his book, that was part of his upbringing in Texas, part of his political experience as governor of Texas, when he came to understand just how important Mexican Americans are, Mexican immigrants are to the life of the United States. And in the preface of the book, President Bush acknowledges that throughout American history, from the very beginning, there have been forces opposing this immigrant basis of American society, forces of nativism, forces of prejudice, forces of exclusion that have always been with us, that are part of our national debate now. It's the kind of, I think, reality that each of us, I'm looking out at this sea of Americans here, each of us has an immigrant story, every single one of us. We can find an ancestor who encountered prejudice in her or his life. We know from his presidency that President Bush is on the side of America's open door to immigration and refugee admittance. In the very first painting of the book, it's not of one of the 43 immigrants. It's a painting by President Bush of the Statue of Liberty. And alongside it, at the beginning of the book, is the epic poem by Emma Lazarus, The New Colossus. And that poem, of course, ends with words that all of us learned probably in the second, third, or fourth grade. Give me your tired, your poor, your huddled masses, yearning to breathe free. the wretched refuse of your teeming shore. Send these, the homeless tempest tossed, to me. I lift my lamp beside the golden door. This is a great book. We're going to have a good conversation today, and let me now introduce our three guests to you. Madeleine K. Albright really deserves a lengthy introduction. All of you know a lot about her. She was our Secretary of State. She was our ambassador to the United Nations. She's a protean woman in the sense that she's also created her own business, Albright Stonebridge, the consulting firm in Washington, longtime professor at Georgetown, celebrated author, and she's someone who's been a great teacher to me and a great mentor to me in many ways, and to many people, I think, on this Zoom call, whether you're a former student from Georgetown or like me, someone who worked for her as I did in 2 different jobs. I have so much respect for her. And Madeleine, of course, I think, as everybody knows, is a refugee, along with her mother and father and sister and brother from Czechoslovakia. Dina Powell McCormick is head of global sustainability and inclusive growth. And here's Madeleine's portrait that was painted by President Bush. I told Madeleine today that, and I think Dina did too, President Bush got her eyes right. It's a beautiful portrait of a remarkable and beautiful woman, Madeleine K. Albright. And now let me say a word about Dina Powell McCormick. Here is the painting by President Bush of Dina. Dina's head of global sustainability and inclusive growth at Goldman Sachs. She's former US Deputy National Security Advisor in the administration of President Trump. She was US Assistant Secretary of State for Education and Cultural Affairs at the State Department, where Dina and I worked together and became very close friends. And she was also Director of White House Personnel. Dina is a senior fellow at the Future Diplomacy Project, our project here at the Harvard Kennedy School. We're really proud of Dina, and Dina and her family are immigrants from Egypt. And finally, Ezinne Uzo-Okoro is a Harvard Kennedy School student. She's going to graduate 2 weeks from tomorrow. I think, Ezinne, with your 3rd master's degree. I got to know Ezinne. She was a student in my Great Powers class, a really good, perceptive, intelligent, knowledgeable student last autumn. She is currently Assistant Director for Space Policy in the White House Office of Science and Technology. She is she has her BA graduate. She is a BA graduate from Rensselaer Polytech in computer science. She is a master's in space system and robotics from Johns Hopkins and from MIT. She's currently a PhD student at MIT, clearly an underachiever in her education and professional achievements. And Ezinne and her family are immigrants from Nigeria. And her story and this portrait are in that book as well. So welcome to all of you. Welcome, Madeleine. Welcome, Dina. Welcome, Ezinne. We're looking forward to a good conversation. I'll ask Ezinne and Dina and Madeleine about their immigrant experience. I'll ask them about why they chose public service, whether or not that immigrant experience that they had was part of the reason they chose public service. And then we'll entertain questions from all of you. So just let us know through the usual Zoom protocol, press the raise hand button. I'll call on as many people as possible. And this event is going to go for 90 minutes. So Madeleine, let me ask you first. And Madeleine, welcome. I think you and I have probably done this kind of conversation, I don't know, 10 or 15 times over the last few years. It's always good to have you here at Harvard. I know your immigrant story, but why don't you tell everybody else? It's actually a refugee story.
Yeah.
What propelled your family to come to the United States, and welcome?
Well, thank you. And I'm delighted to be a part of this with Dina and Ezinne and everybody. Things in life I never expected was to have my portrait painted by a president of the United States. So, but let me tell my story because it all is very much a part of the situation of the 20th century. I was born in Czechoslovakia in 1937, and my father was a Czechoslovak diplomat. And when the Nazis marched in 1939, my parents escaped to live in London during the Blitz. We were there all through the war. My father worked for the government in exile there, and his job was to broadcast over BBC into Czechoslovakia. We spent the Blitz in London in an apartment in Notting Hill Gate before it got fancy. And it was a big apartment house with refugees. And I spent most of my time in the cellar during air raid or warnings, and then came out in the morning to see buildings destroyed. After the Blitz, we moved out to Walton-on-Thames, a small town, and my father continued what he was doing. And I was a very, very proper little English girl. After the war, my father went back to Czechoslovakia. We lived in Prague briefly while he was chief of staff to the foreign minister. And then they made him ambassador to Yugoslavia. And the little girl in the national costume that gives flowers at the airport, that's what I did for a living. I was in Belgrade for quite a while. My father didn't want me going to school with the communists. And so I had a governess, and I got ahead of myself. And in Europe, you can't go into the next grouping until you're a certain age. So they sent me to school in Switzerland. I didn't speak French. They wouldn't feed me unless I learned French. So I learned French. And then what happened was my father, because he was a professional diplomat, his 3 years were up. And his next assignment was to be the representative of Czechoslovakia on a new commission to deal with India and Pakistan over Kashmir. And he was looking forward to doing that when there was the communist coup in Czechoslovakia in February 1948. And his best friends in Belgrade were the British and American ambassadors. And they said, if you resign, they're going to name some communist and nothing's going to happen. And so it would be good if you stayed on and worked with our governments. So he took that. And then what happened was, in the meantime, my mother, brother, and sister and I came to the United States. We didn't have a terrible escape kind of story through barbed wire or anything. We did come on the SS America, November 11th, 1948. And I remember sailing by the Statue of Liberty. And so we lived on Long Island for a while because the UN was at on Long Island. My father came to the United States and he defected and asked for political asylum. And so, and when I actually got to the State Department, they gave me the letter that he had written begging for political asylum. What then happened was that my father, at that stage, the Rockefeller Foundation was finding jobs, I think, for Central European intellectuals or whatever. And they found him a job at the University of Denver. And we had no idea where Denver was. And my parents bought a car and started driving across America. And my mother said, they said, Denver's the mile-high city, but we're not going up. So maybe we're going the wrong direction. And anyway, we ended up in Denver. My parents loved Denver. My father taught there and he taught diplomatic history. And ultimately they named the school in his honor. And so my story is one of having been raised in a diplomatic family. I did not become an American citizen until I was a sophomore in college, between my sophomore and junior year at Wellesley. But as I was reading about Dina's life, we had in common the fact that we had fairly ethnic parents. And all I wanted to do was just to be a plain old American. When we first came to the US, it was right before Thanksgiving. And I remember singing We Gather Together, the hymn then, and I heard somebody asking for God's blessing. And I thought, who is asking? And I figured out I was asking. And from then on, I asked. And all I wanted to do was just to be taken for an American, everything. And at the same time, I had these very ethnic parents. And my mother cooked all kinds of crazy Czech food, all very fattening. And then she had a hobby, which was reading people's palms. And she had no control over what she said. And she would sit next to some man while his wife was on the other side. And she'd say, you're going to have many affairs. She predicted that I would have 3 sons. I have 3 daughters. And my father wanted to also be accepted in Colorado, which meant fishing. And he went fishing every Sunday. We went with him, except that he fished in a coat and tie. And then I remember many of us have been in Aspen, going to Maroon Bells where the echo is huge. And he caught a fish and he said, and they both had accents. And he said, I got one. And there were a bunch of teenage boys there. And every time they caught a fish, they'd say, I got one. But my story is really of having been accepted in many different ways, except for the following thing. I had to go to to high school on scholarship because my parents wanted me to go to this particular private school. And I went to Wellesley on scholarship. And what I didn't realize, and I will stop here, is that I all of a sudden I was at Wellesley, and they had a system whereby visitors were announced all over the whole dorm. And somebody said, Maddie Corbell, there are 2 women here from Boston that want to show you what the American girl wears. So I came down in my Bermuda shorts and Shetland sweater, which was the uniform. And I said, what? And they said, well, you are a member of the Cosmos Club which had 2/3 foreign students and 1/3 American students. And I hadn't focused on the fact that I was a foreign student. And so I'd go to the meetings and other people would say how they'd heard about Wellesley from various people in their countries. And I said, well, 2 of my teachers went to Wellesley. But I did become a citizen, and it was the greatest thing ever between my sophomore and junior year. And I am a grateful American.
Madeleine, thank you. You've told me your story before. It's a remarkable story. You arrived as a Czech refugee. When did you start to feel in your mind American?
Well, I think that I started feeling an American actually at Wellesley in many different ways, because I was accepted. I mean, it's very weird because there were certain moments where I thought this is not, I went to the dean now students know what their SAT scores are. And for some reason I went to see the dean and she kept saying, remarkable, remarkable. I think she said it because she thought I was a foreign student and didn't speak English. And so there were certain moments, or believe it or not, there used to be a thing that people that came to the United States had to register aliens. There were all these posters everywhere, aliens must register. And my classmates made fun of me by putting posters all over my room saying aliens must register. But I really did feel very much like an American. And I have to tell this story. It's not very nice about the British, but when we were in England, my father used to say that people would say, we're so sorry that your country's been taken over by a terrible dictator. You're welcome here. What can we do to help you? And when are you going home? And when we came to the United States, people would say, we're so sorry your country's been taken over by a terrible system. You're welcome here. What can we do to help you? And when will you become a citizen? And he said, that's what made America different from every other country. And that's what I grew up with.
Madeleine, thank you. And if you don't mind, your father had such an outsized influence on thousands of students over a long academic career, but there was one student in particular.
Can I tell this story?
Please tell about his favorite student.
So what happened was my father did become a big deal in Denver, and was one of those things where people always wanted opinions about what was going on in communist countries. And so he became pretty well known. He died in 1977, and there were lots of flowers and tributes and everything everywhere, and in the church. And so among them was this ceramic pot in the shape of a piano with just some leaves in it. So I said to my mother, where did this come from? And she said, it's from your father's favorite student, Condoleezza Rice. Her parents were associated with the University of Denver. She was a music major, hence the piano. And the story is the following, is that she took a course from my father. He persuaded her to be an international relations major. She had her master's from Notre Dame, and she was back at the University of Denver doing her PhD with my father. So this African-American music major from Alabama was doing her dissertation on the Czechoslovak military. So in 1987, when I was working for my long list of losing Democratic presidential candidates, I was working for Michael Dukakis, and my job was to find foreign policy advisors. And I thought, this woman teaches Soviet affairs on the West Coast, I'll call her. So I called her up and I told her what I was doing. And she said, Madeleine, I don't know how to tell you this, but I'm a Republican. And I said, Condi, how could you be? We had the same father. And it really is remarkable that this Czechoslovak diplomat, a refugee, basically trained 2 secretaries of state, 2 women.
Madeleine, thank you. Remarkable stories. We're going to come back and talk about how you got into public service, what motivated you, but let's hear the stories of Dina and Ezinne. And Dina, as we welcome you, there's a short clip of you, I think made by the Bush Library, that we want to show as we introduce this.
One day, my parents got to come to the White House, and my father was really nervous, as you can imagine.
I saw Dina through the window of Marine One as I landed on the south lawn. She was standing there with a man I knew must have been her father.
He kind of made a beeline to my dad, and he said, "You must be Mr. Habib." And my father was in shock. He couldn't respond.
I said, "I just wanted to tell you that you raised a great girl. She's a very important advisor to me."
And he walked away. And it took a few seconds, and my dad tried to compose himself.
"It's a lot to take in," he told her after I walked away. "As proud as I am of you, there's really no other country in the world
where a man can bring a little girl who doesn't speak a word of English and one day watch her serve the president of his adopted country."
Dina, that's a remarkable video clip. And you have a remarkable story. Welcome. As I said, Dina is a fellow in our program here at the Kennedy School. She's been a great mentor to a lot of our students, and we thank you for that. Dina, tell us about that trip from Egypt to the United States for your family.
Well, thank you so much. I'm so honored to be here, especially with Secretary Albright and Ezinne, and of course, my dear, dear friend, Ambassador Burns. Every time I see that clip, I get a little bit choked up, and it does remind you. It just reminds you of the power of our country. What's so interesting about the 3 of us is that all 3 of us are immigrants, and all 3 of us served in the White House and State Department. And what other country, Secretary Albright, not only welcomes refugees, welcomes immigrants to their country, but then asks them to serve in the highest levels of the government? I mean, that is a pretty extraordinary thing. Gosh, it's hard to follow Secretary Albright's story. It is extraordinary. I have to say, I was with President Bush when he unveiled her portrait. He's so proud of Ezinne and Secretary Albright's portrait, but he did say, Secretary Albright's is one of my finest pieces of work. I was born, as the book talks about, in Cairo, Egypt. My father was a captain in the Egyptian army and under Anwar Sadat. And he was amongst his advisors who was really pushing him to make peace with Israel. He was very junior, but there was a faction in Egypt at that time because, if you think about it, it was 43 years ago that Anwar Sadat went to Jerusalem and made peace with Israel, and just an incredibly historic peace agreement that has held all these years, which is pretty remarkable. My mother had just graduated from the American University in Cairo, and I think that they were hopeful about the future of the country. They had 2 young daughters at the time and had a 3rd later when we immigrated. But I think they did honestly begin to realize we're a Christian minority, we're Coptic Christian. And in Egypt, sadly, both the Coptic Christian community and, of course, many years prior to that, the Jewish community, which had been a thriving community in Egypt, was diminishing, and there was increasing discrimination and in many cases persecution. And so they said, combination of Coptic Christians, young girls, we think there's a hope that we've heard about this country, America, where if we immigrate, hopefully our girls can reach their potential. So we immigrated when I was nearly 5 years old, didn't speak English. Moved to Dallas, Texas, and this is when the ethnic part meets culture shock, Secretary Albright. People say, how did you learn English? I said, well, I was young. My parents sacrificed a lot so that I could go to good schools. Learning English wasn't the problem. It was learning Texan that was a whole nother level of difficulty. There I was, I'll never forget it. My first grade classroom, wanting so much to speak Texan, be friends with all the young, cute girls who were popular. And I opened up my lunchbox and it was hummus and grape leaves. And I was just like, oh, how much I want a turkey sandwich right now and potato chips. I learned later, though, how much I treasured the fact that my parents were telling me and my sisters every day, you have no idea how lucky you are to be becoming an American, but we never want you to forget where you came from. And that was why it was so important to them to remain speaking our language, Arabic at home, eating the food from our heritage. And couldn't have imagined all those years ago that would one day actually help me in government when I served President Bush after 9/11 alongside of you, Ambassador Burns. And so it is a journey, not dissimilar to many people in the book, but I think the thing that sort of binds it together is this true sense of gratitude to the country that has allowed us to become citizens. I didn't become a citizen until I was nearly 17 years old. So also took a long, long time. And it was the proudest day of my life. I remember it so clearly, proudest day of my parents' lives as well.
Dina, thank you. What kind of hurdles did you face? Discrimination? When did you begin to feel part of this culture? You were from another culture. I know you probably went back to see your relatives as well. What was that like for you?
It was harder, I think, for my parents. I mean, I was young. I stood out as the, immigrant girl who didn't speak great English and wore funny clothes. My parents, had to do all kinds of things to make ends meet. There's a story in the book that President Bush, I actually didn't know until I started, the process of talking to him about my family's history, where many years after I went to high school in Dallas at a Catholic school named Ursuline Academy, and went to the University of Texas. And really, to pay for college, I first waitressed for a year and a half, and then I had the chance to work in the Texas State Senate. Never thinking I was going to get into government or politics, because growing up, my parents would tell me something that I bet, Ezinne, you heard sometimes, especially, we left our homeland, our church, everything behind so that you and your sisters could become anything you want to be, as long as you're a lawyer, a doctor, or an engineer. These were the safe professions that ensured that I could take care of myself and have a stable career, because they couldn't imagine politics or government, because in Egypt, ordinary citizens don't participate, in that same way. And so I dutifully was accepted to law school. I was heading there. I had the chance very randomly to go to Washington and what I thought would just be a one-year deferral. And of course, that ended up being, working for President Bush and Secretary Rice, and eventually going to Goldman Sachs. And so all those years, I was pretty proud of what I was doing. And I thought, they were proud too, but they kept all those years saying, when are you going back to law school? Because they wanted me to get that degree. And I think the day that they finally realized maybe I was going to be okay was when we went to a board dinner, a Goldman Sachs board dinner in Dallas at one of President Bush's best friends, Harlan Crow. And as we were driving up the driveway, my father came with me as my date. And we were going into this beautiful home. And he said, Dina, I've been here before. And I said, Dad, I love you. You have not been to Harlan Crow's house. I think I would have known. And he said, no, I'm remembering what it was. I mowed this lawn for 2 years when we first moved to the United States. And now I'm walking in, as the date of my daughter at Goldman Sachs. And so I think that moment was one of the most crystallizing for how much, they had to work pretty hard, like millions of immigrants across the country, but they hid some of that from their daughters because they wanted us to not sort of be burdened with just how much they had to do to keep food on the table and get us into good schools.
Dina, thank you. And we've got a pretty good law school at Harvard if you're interested. We can talk about that.
I don't know if I could get in.
Make your parents proud, right? Dina, thank you. Ezinne, I just want to say again, we're so proud of you. You'll get your degree in Harvard Yard if you come back 2 weeks from tomorrow. You've been a great student at the Kennedy School. And I know you've got a lot going on because as you graduate, you've already started your new job. What's your family's immigrant story? What's your story as you came to the United States?
Thank you, Ambassador Burns. It's an honor and a delight to be here and participate in this discussion. So I was born in Nigeria, in a small town called Owerri in the southeastern part. And life felt really idyllic, but I realized after a while it was because we never really left our compound, or we didn't really get to go to the market or go to grocery stores with my parents. They just always tended to keep us at home. And I was bored as a 9-year-old, and I picked up a copy of my dad's Robert Schuller book. It was one of the 2 books I brought to America, actually. Its title is Success is Never Ending, Failure is Never Final. And he talks about Walt Disney in that book. And Walt Disney wrote down ideas. He always had a pen and paper next to his bedside. So I thought, okay, I can do that. And I would come up with all these problems that we had, that you don't have electricity on all the time in Nigeria. Didn't know how to fix that. We never knew who was calling because this is before caller ID and before cell phones in the 80s. I was born in 1983. And I thought, well, is there a way to know who's calling and to put a camera on either end? I didn't like my dad's organizer. We called it a filofax, and he always had bits of paper sticking out. And I thought, well, it would be great if he had something digital. And I saw a little segment of technology on TV once, on CNN, I believe, where they thought people could read their schedule on their glasses. And I thought, I have to be a part of that. But I didn't know how to implement these things. And that's when I really started asking questions about my future. What are we doing? Where will I go to university? And why was my dad? My dad was a bit different from other dads. He was very optimistic. He was very upbeat. And that's when I learned that he went to college in California. And my parents got married in Sunnyvale, but they left afterwards. This is still in the 70s. They left after his degree to raise their kids back in Nigeria. They were thankful for the education and went back home. But there were no prospects in Nigeria. So he worked actually for a British company, for Thomas Cook Traveler's Checks, if anyone remembers Traveler's Checks from the 80s. And he helped transport those traveler's checks to Africa. And so as he was doing that, and I peppered him with questions about his time in America and whether I would have, what I know now is intellectual freedom, but I didn't really know how to articulate that feeling of just having ideas and implementing them and being an inventor. And quite like Dina mentioned, an inventor doesn't really fall into the lawyer, doctor, engineer camp. So I found out about computer science. I told them all about it. And I said, I think I can do that and build things out of nothing. And my dad was a bit worried because he said, well, we'll try to get the family to America. But if we go, you may want to do something safer. And I said, you'll see. I asked for their patience. They would see that computer science really was a good way to contribute to society as a whole. I was 15, I graduated from high school quite early because I had skipped a few grades, and we had a stopover in England because of some of the paperwork, which took 10 years because my father did not think to file for a green card when he was going to college in the 70s. And so he tried to file much later, and I waited and waited and waited, and after high school we could go, and we spent a few months in England, but we finally made it, and I went straight to Rensselaer Polytechnic Institute, and I was overwhelmed. I was overwhelmed by just all of this opportunity, what felt like endless opportunities in America, and I had too many ideas, too little time. And I was just so grateful to be here.
Thank you very much. You've been working for NASA. So after that computer science degree at RPI, I know you have degrees from MIT and Johns Hopkins in space policy and robotics. What got you interested in space?
I ended up there serendipitously. So I used my American liberties to gain more confidence. I was a very shy and timid girl, and you know, in Nigeria, you have to be careful when speaking to your elders. Sometimes you're not even supposed to make eye contact. But here, people were interested in what I had to say. Adults were interested in what I had to say. So I marched up to the job fair. I was 19 years old. I was close to graduating. And there was a NASA booth, and the gentleman there was not taking any applicants. He was not accepting any resumes. He was just there for outreach. So I marched up and I said, you know, excuse me, sir, your line is about 30 minutes long. And it turns out you're not taking any resumes, and they're bright engineers at the school. Is there a reason why? You know, so I tried to accost him, and he was so surprised that I walked up to him to do that. And he asked to see my resume. He said, well, if you all are so smart, what does your resume look like? And after a few minutes of conversation, he said he would send my resume to the team who's working with, which happened to be at the Goddard Space Flight Center in Maryland. And I was the only person from that job fair who got a job at NASA. So I didn't know about NASA as a child. I didn't know anything about space. So there are two kinds of people who work at NASA: people who grew up with Apollo and understand and love the space program so much. And then there are others like me who fell into it and who have a, what I call a cool and calculated lens towards our space program. And I'm so grateful that he listened to me and he gave me the opportunity, because it's changed my life. I've learned so much and feel that I can contribute to my country and the world.
Thank you. So now you're at the White House. You've been there for 2 weeks, at least virtually. And Dina has worked at the White House. Madeleine worked at the White House in the Carter administration. All of you were expected from your testimony today to be doctors, lawyers, or engineers. You all ended up at the White House in public service as Secretary of State, as Deputy National Security Advisor, and now as an advisor to President Biden on space policy. Tell us about that journey, Madeleine. Did your parents push you into public service, or did it come from you? How did you end up devoting your life to the country? And Madeleine, you're on mute.
The only thing my parents ever pushed me into was studying and doing something to do with foreign policy. We never talked about anything other than foreign policy and diplomatic history. And I actually thought that I was going to be a journalist. And that one of the things that happened was I had tried to be a journalist. My husband was one. We were in Chicago and I was looking for a job and having dinner with his managing editor. And he looks at me and he says, "So what are you going to do, honey?" And I said, "I'm going to work for a newspaper." And he said, "I don't think so. You can't work on the same paper as your husband because of labor regulations." And even though there were 3 other papers in Chicago at the time, and he said, "And you wouldn't want to compete with your husband, so go find something else to do." And so I did. I went to work for Encyclopedia Britannica. That's actually a book, or was. And I think that what is interesting is I then spent a lot of time getting a PhD. But the way that I got involved in government service was through politics and really being involved in political campaigns. And I worked for Ed Muskie, who I went on his staff to work for him as his chief legislative assistant. And my story has an awful lot to do with, I know one isn't supposed to say good luck, but in terms of people that I knew and what they needed and wanted at the time. So it turns out Brzezinski was my professor at Columbia. An amazing man, because in 1963, believe it or not, he was already teaching about comparative communism, thinking that there were different kinds, which I found very interesting. Anyway, I'm working for Muskie. I get a call from Brzezinski saying that that he wanted to talk to me about a job. He called first to say, had I heard that he'd been named National Security Advisor? And I said, yes, of course I've heard that. And he said, well, can you find me a place to live? And I said, geez, Big, I thought you were calling to offer me a job. And he said, no, I'm calling to ask you to find me a place to live. So I did find him a place to live. And then 2 years later, he actually did hire me to come and work at the White House doing congressional relations. And the most amazing thing for those of us that have been there is how small it is, frankly. I have, and by the way, I say this to my students, if you have a choice between a big fancy office in the old executive office building with marble or a closet in the West Wing, choose the closet. And I did choose a closet that was right outside the Situation Room. And I was able to be in every meeting that President Carter had with members of Congress. But the thing I could not get over, and I'm sure that all of us feel the same way, is that you're in the White House and the history of the White House. And every time you go out on the lawn to greet the helicopter, and Zbig used to say, never forget when you're out there greeting the helicopter, and never forget where you are. And I think it is so, being in the White House is one of the most stunning experiences, I think, of anybody's life. But those of us that have a sense of history, and I loved it. I have a lot of great stories, but I really do think that I wasn't pushed into government service, but I sure am glad I got there, because there is no greater honor than public service. And I never expected to have the kinds of positions I had. And I do think that as a refugee or an immigrant, if I dare say so, it's even more important. And one of my favorite experiences, and President Bush wrote about this, is that I like giving naturalization. The first time I gave a naturalization certificate was on July 4th, 2000 at Monticello. And I figured since I had Thomas Jefferson's job, I actually could do this. And so I gave this man his naturalization certificate, and he walks away, and I hear him saying, "Can you believe that I'm a refugee and I just got my naturalization certificate from the Secretary of State?" And so I went up to him afterwards and I said, "Can you believe that a refugee is Secretary of State?" And it never, ever would have occurred to me that that was possible. And I'd never imagined it. And so I will never forget the honor. And I'm so unbelievably grateful to, and someday be a footnote in American history.
You're going to be more than a footnote in American history, Madam Secretary. Can I ask you about a phenomenon that was always disturbing to me in my foreign service career, and that is that, and I never faced this prejudice, but many times foreign service officers who are naturalized Americans, who had come here as immigrants or refugees, particularly Asian Americans, were implicitly, subtly, sometimes questioned about dual loyalties to the United States, loyalties to their homeland. Nobody ever asked me about loyalty to Ireland. It seemed like a double standard. That's still with us. Did you face that? I know, because you focused a lot on Europe and you were from the heart of the crisis during the Cold War. Well, first of all, let me say it was interesting to get my clearances in the first place. I first got those when I was on the Hill, but there really was a question because, as I mentioned, the history of coming here was kind of complicated because my father actually had worked for a communist government for a few months. And we were getting our citizenship during the McCarthy era. And so there really were questions about, how, why, et cetera. I did get my clearances. But then what happened, and I'm interested that you're asking the question the way you have, because one of the things that was happening in the 90s was, with the end of the Cold War, how would the US work with the newly freed Central European countries? And I deliberately, one of the discussions was about the expansion of NATO. And I deliberately tried to stay out of that discussion. I'm not the one that originated it. And you know that, Nick, and so I tried to stay out of it. But then what happened, while I was at the United Nations, there was a program called Partnership for Peace, which was building kind of a pre-NATO activity. And General Shalikashvili, who was also an immigrant and a refugee, was chairman of the Joint Chiefs. And we were asked to go to explain to the countries in Central and Eastern Europe
that they were not getting into NATO. And our first trip was to Lech Wałęsa in Poland, who was quite angry. And I said, it's just an accident of history that 2 out of the 5 principals on the National Security Council were born not far away from here. And Shali said, and you will have an office and a filing cabinet and a phone at the headquarters at NATO. And then we had to go to all the other Eastern European countries, and we did it very quickly, and we were afraid we would get mixed up about where we were. So we made a plan as we were getting off the plane that I would do AOH, accident of history, he would do the filing cabinet, and then we would say, we're so glad to be in your country to meet your leader. But there were questions always about later, as I was there when NATO expanded, whether I was prejudiced about not dual loyalty, but whether I kind of felt that there needed to be, those countries needed to come into NATO. And by the way, it was the same thing in many ways that Brzezinski was accused of, of being very tough on communists. And I do think that there are questions, more not loyalty, but kind of way of thinking, whether it affected the way you thought.
Thank you very much, Madeleine. Dina, so your folks wanted you to have a legal career in Dallas, Texas. You had your 1-year opportunity to serve in Washington. You never looked back. You had not planned on public service career, I guess, in high school and college. What led you to it?
I really fell into it, to be honest with you. Working in the Texas State Senate, it was, an upgrade from waitressing at the Tavern, a great restaurant in Austin. But I immediately realized in the Texas State Senate, and then as a young Hill staffer, how much influence very young people could have. I mean, if you join a law firm, maybe in 10 or 12 years, you make partner and then you become kind of a senior person. But as all of us know, I mean, look at Ezinne. She's going to make space policy for the United States government. It is extraordinary. And there's something so, inspiring. And I encourage many of the students on today. I've had the privilege, as has Secretary Albright, to work both in public and private sectors. I hope that all of you will consider public service, because the influence that you can have is so meaningful. And what I couldn't have imagined, honestly, Nick, though, was the role that I eventually had. I worked on the president's campaign. I went in the transition. And then ultimately was there, working in presidential personnel, almost living at the White House. All of you know, every president, right when he is sworn in, must fill over 5,000 political appointees, nearly 1,000 that require Senate confirmation, the cabinet, the sub-cabinet, ambassadors, all the important roles that really set the policy of a new administration. We were 7 months in. And working literally around the clock when the tragedy of 9/11 happened. And I'll just obviously never forget it. I was in the White House. I was interviewing someone who I've never named, but it was someone to be the SEC commissioner. And they were sitting in the office, and the Secret Service, who you and the Secretary and Ezinne will know soon, are unbelievably polite, unbelievably wonderful. And I thought something was off when they slammed open the door of my office, ran in, and were actually cursing and screaming, "Take off your shoes and run out of here right now." And what was happening is that in their earpiece was the evacuation signal, because Flight 93 was either heading to the Capitol or the White House. And it was but for Todd Beamer that a greater tragedy happened. And of course, this was also after the Pentagon had been hit. So I literally remember running, gathering the interns, getting everyone out of the office, running out to 17th Street, 16th Street, and not knowing exactly what to do. But it took me extra longer. I was wobbling because I was 8 months pregnant with my first daughter. And so the thing that I remember most, honestly, was I thought, they're never going to let us back in the White House. I don't know why that was the feeling I had at that moment as we were getting ready to take everybody home somewhere so we could all get away from the White House, which is what we were instructed to do. And I just remember thinking, I wonder, I mean, the whole world has changed. The loss of life and tragedy is unimaginable. And what will happen? And I will never forget, President Bush convened a meeting for the entire staff the next morning at 8:15. And the message he was sending to the world that he sent so beautifully in the months to come was, you will never defeat us. This terrorism, this ideology will not defeat America. And so it was in the weeks and months after that that you and I got to know each other, because I was working so closely with then National Security Advisor Rice, not only on the national security positions that were now unbelievably important and moved to the top of the list to be filled immediately, but that was when I started to be able to use my heritage, my language, play a very small part. When I talk to my daughters about it today, I always tell them, I already was in a position of enormous gratitude to be serving our country, but to just then think, is there anything else that I could possibly do? It's what all of us who've served government think in moments of great crisis. What could I possibly do to play a tiny role in supporting the president and the government? And so that hit home pretty hard for me.
Thank you very, very much. Ezinne, did you feel when you were at RPI and beyond that you had a debt to the United States? Was that the motivation to go into public service? You wanted to give back, or was it something that just came out of your interest in space policy that led you to NASA and now to the White House?
Dina's story and Secretary Albright's story are just so remarkable and compelling. It's tough to follow. But my mother is a nurse who delivers babies, and every day, she still says it till today, whenever anyone has any health issue, if you're in the United States, if you're on US soil, what she tells you is, it's gonna be okay. You're here, they're going to figure out what's wrong, and they'll take care of you. If you're not in America, she wants to, well, pray for you, one, and two, figure out if you can get on US soil, because she just believes in preventative medicine and just the ability to take care of people here, because in Nigeria, a lot of people lost their lives for procedures that we take for granted in this country. And so she was a nurse within the government, and she served, and she was just always grateful that we were here and we had access to good health care. And so she always said we had to give back, we had to give back. So I knew college is only 4 years, so I'd only been here for 4 years, but I knew that I was going to give back and I owed this country something. And then personally, because of this intellectual freedom that I felt I had gained, I really wanted to do something to show my gratitude. And so when I had the job offer to consider NASA versus, say, the corporate world, it was an easy choice. And you have to remember, I didn't really know NASA's history, so I wasn't seduced by the history. It was our family's gratitude to this country, and I knew I had to serve. I first thought I could do it for a year or two, but I was having so much fun, for one, and it just felt like the biggest honor to work for the US government and to contribute to our national space program. And then moving into space policy, Ambassador Burns, you were such a force for good in my journey to space policy from engineering, and you were very encouraging. And as Secretary Albright mentioned, this is a place where people are just very supportive and encouraging of dreams. And you encouraged me last fall, and you saw me in such a role when I didn't see myself, and here I am. It's incredible.
Well, we're really happy you are where you are, and we're proud of you, and you've made the right choice, and we look forward to hearing great things about our space program and your involvement with it. So thank you for your stories, each of you. We're going to go to questions, but before we do, Madeleine, I'll just ask you this question. We're facing as a country some fundamental choices about immigration and about refugee admittance. The president has said, and I think quite rightly, that we've got to raise our sights on refugee admissions, at least to 62,500 refugees. President Trump had really kind of zeroed out refugee admissions for the first time in, I think, 70 years. We didn't take a refugee into this country at the end of 2019, December 19, January 20. It's the first time that it happened. We need to return to legal immigration of the type that Ezinne and Dina came into this country through, because we've cut that too much. And of course, there's the whole controversy about the 11 million undocumented immigrants, the dreamers, currently in the United States. I know you've thought a lot about this. You're one of our foremost advocates for human rights. How important are these decisions? And do you think the president and the Congress, because Congress is involved, obviously, can agree on doing the right thing to reopen the country to legal immigration?
Well, I think that it is the key to what America is and America's greatness and the next phase of America. I do think it's important to state the following. Every country has the right to make its mind up about how they do immigration and refugees and the law. And I think that the law in this is very important. But, and it always kind of sounds self-serving, but I really do think that refugees and immigrants have done a lot for America. And that, speaking on behalf of all of us, we are very grateful to be here and in very many ways do want to give back. I think it is very short-sighted in terms of America's future, all of a sudden, what happened in the last administration of just cutting people off. And I have to say, kind of blew my mind that those who actually, whose parents or grandparents or whatever had come to the United States. There were not a lot of people in the last administration that actually were Native American descendants. And so it was hypocritical. I do think that we are moving in the right direction with this. I think that the Biden administration is taking it very seriously. And I do think, and I hope that the role that Congress has to play in this will be one that makes it possible to have a generous policy on this. On the dreamers, I have to say, I am stunned when I've met a lot of dreamers, and they are all on pins and needles, frankly, about what's going to happen. But the bottom line is they have already contributed to America in so many different ways. And I think that it is totally unjust to have that all take so long, because they are either already in professions or they have been in the military serving our country. They have paid taxes. They have done all kinds of things. But I would like to see progress based on the ideas and policies that the Biden administration has put out there, and fully cognizant of that none of this is simple, frankly. I have been doing quite a few task forces on refugees and wondering how things work at the borders and a variety of issues. And it is, I know we all get sick of this phrase, it is complicated, but it has to be done. It is America. And I don't want to see the Statue of Liberty weeping. I see the glorious picture of the Statue of Liberty. And I think that we need to be who we are and who we have been and who we need to be.
And we need leadership from the top, which I think we're going to have from President Biden and from Secretary Blinken. That's so important. When Marian Anderson, the great African-American soprano, was prevented from singing at Constitution Hall by the Daughters of the American Revolution, Eleanor Roosevelt invited her to sing at the White House. FDR then addressed the DAR. I think his mother may have been a member the next year, and opened his address, "Fellow immigrants," just to remind them about what's uniquely American. So Madeleine, thank you for that. Let's go to questions for Madeleine Albright, for Ezinne Uzo-Okoro, from Dina Powell McCormick. We'll get as many questions in as we can. And the first person, I'm happy to say, who wants to say a few words is my good friend, Professor Ash Carter. Ash.
Hi there, I'm just passing through, but I wanted to pay my respects. Ezinne is a student of mine, and everybody including me, is a student of Madeleine Albright. Madeleine's been great throughout my entire life. Ezinne is gonna be like a meteor. She's amazingly talented. She's got a great place she's going now, and it's great. Dina is an affiliate of our center. So Nick, I don't have any questions. That I said I'm just passing through, but I wanted to pay my respects to everyone. And dear Madeleine, who I've known so long, it's always so wonderful to see you and to listen to you and to be inspired by you. And inspiration is what America is about to me. And when it's less than that, it breaks my heart as someone who's been doing this for a while, and you've always kept spirits up. So that's great. And then Ezinne, you're going to go in there and not only change the world, it's bigger than that. You're going to change the cosmos. So hello, that's all I wanted to do, Nick. I just wanted to pay respects.
Ash, Professor Carter, thank you so much for being with us. Wenxi, please.
Thank you, Ambassador Burns. So I'm Ash Center Fellow, and more importantly, used to work for Dina and at the State Department as well. So I've always been an admirer of Secretary Albright as well as Dina Powell, who have just such great stories as immigrants, and myself, an immigrant from Taiwan as well. So my question is, it seems that when our foreign policy, for example, post 9/11 or now because of our tensions with China, are such that, there's always some kind of whether it's, Arabs community or now, the growing anti-Asian sort of sentiment. And how do we strike a balance? I don't think we can say they're completely disconnected. There's some connection. They're obviously not completely connected. But as someone, who cares a lot about our communities, but also foreign policy. So just wondering if anyone has any advice.
Wenxi, thank you. It's such a good question. You reflect, this has been an age-old problem of anti-Asian bias, the Chinese Exclusion Act of the late 19th century in the United States. And now the anti-Asian violence that we've seen in America over the last several months. This is a profound question. Who would like in our panel?
Well, let me just a very profound and difficult question. And I have to explain it to myself this way. First of all, given how we got to the United States, I have always thought of America as a perfect country, frankly. And I tried to learn a lot of history and have obviously worked on that. And when I'm growing up in Denver, there were a few people from south of the Mexicans, but I didn't even know a Black person until I ended up until college. And for me, trying to really relearn American history and understand our lack of perfection on issues, and especially some of the stories about the Asians and internments and all terrible things, I think, and the things that we're going through now, America has to admit that we have had systemic racism and that we have a society that has the tools for dealing with rectifying this. But I think admitting the horror of some of these histories is the first part. And we need the help of the various communities that are being discriminated against so that we can work together in order to have an admission, but also a movement forward. But I have to admit, in my case, I just thought this was a perfect place, and it hasn't been a perfect place, and countries have to deal with their histories.
Yeah, I'd love to add just a couple of thoughts because I'm so proud of Wenxi. And I will start by saying it's incredible to be one of, have her on the team at State. But what she doesn't get enough credit for is there wouldn't be a 10,000 women program at Goldman Sachs without the work that Wenxi did. I'm so heartbroken, Wenxi, today when I look at what is happening to the Asian American community. And I'm so proud when I see a lot of voices coming, like Secretary Albright just said, in support of that. We were talking about 9/11. Many of you may not remember that 3 days after 9/11, President Bush actually went to a mosque. And it was a very important symbol to show the American people that, as angry as we rightly were, that we could not turn that anger inward. And I also will just share a story as Secretary Albright is talking about racial equity. We're very proud at Goldman now to have launched a program called 1 Million Black Women. And it really is an affirmation that there are gaps, plain and simple. There are opportunity gaps for the very pillars of Black communities across the country. And if you could meet those gaps, if you could close those gaps, the opportunity would be enormous. And not just for those extraordinary women, but they lift up Black families across the country. And I think that that's something that not just government is responsible for, but the private sector as well. But my favorite story, since we're talking about Secretary Albright's sister, Condi Rice, I have to tell you a story, and Nick remembers because he was on this trip with us. We were in the Middle East a couple of years after 9/11. We had accompanied Secretary Rice, and we had met with, princes and kings and lots of important leaders. And in this one meeting, a very important leader turned to her and said, "Don't come here and lecture me about democracy. I don't want to hear it." And Secretary Rice looked at him and said, "Your Highness, I would never come here and lecture you. In fact, in my own country, many, many, many years ago, but not long enough, I was considered 3/5 of a person. And so we are on a journey in America to form a more perfect union." And I'm not lecturing, I'm just sharing with you that if you believe that investing in the rights of your people and the future of your people will make for a more peaceful and prosperous country, we want to support that. And so I think being honest, as Secretary Albright said, even in those moments, is one of the most humble ways that we can talk about these issues in our country, and frankly, the most diplomatic, representation that we can give to it.
Dina, thank you. Madeleine, thank you. Madeleine, you said we have to face our past, and of course, you're right. We at the Harvard Kennedy School have been trying over the last year to face our responsibilities for racial justice, to achieve greater racial justice in our hiring, in who gets on Zoom screens on behalf of Harvard Kennedy School, and on how we practice becoming a multiracial, multi-religious, multi-ethnic society. And I want to pay tribute to Erica Meniselis, who organized this entire event today. Erica's taken the lead for us in our part of the Belfer Center in trying to hold ourselves to high standards on modeling good behavior and good practices. And yesterday, she and Tori Taussig co-chaired a meeting with representatives of the US, French, and British governments. How are they confronting racism in Britain, France, and the United States as a matter of national policy? So Erica, thank you for what you're doing and what you did to organize today's event, but particularly yesterday's event, which was so important. The next questioner is Eugene Kogan, and let me just say, Eugene has an immigrant story. Eugene and I worked for 5 years, and Madeleine, Eugene was our research director on our Secretaries of State project. We've been interviewing every Secretary of State, and you came to visit us, and Eugene organized your visit. And Eugene, welcome.
Thank you so much, Ambassador Burns, and such an honor to be here, such a personal privilege, really. As Ambassador Burns mentioned, Madam Secretary, I've had a chance, a very unique chance. I pinch myself, as an immigrant from Moscow, to have a chance to meet all of the Secretaries of State since Henry Kissinger. But when people ask me who was the most inspirational, to use Secretary Carter's word, I just wrote this to you in my book that I just sent you. I wrote in the inscription that I do not hesitate for a second when people ask me that, and I say, Madeleine Albright, with whom I had a chance to have a full conversation in fluent Russian. I don't know if you remember this outside the Charles Hotel. In fact, if you may allow me, I have a picture of you and me on my wall. I was much younger then and my hair was much darker then, but I still look at that picture and I treasure those moments. So thank you so much. I have two questions. One, kind of a funny question, whether you still practice your Russian, and if you don't, I am always available. I'd love to speak Russian more with you. But one more serious, and that is you're known for your brooches, and I noticed the one that you're wearing today. I'm curious, if you were going in to a meeting with President Biden, what brooch would you wear and why?
Yeah. Well, first of all, I would be very happy to practice Russian, because what's happened to me at the moment is I speak Slav because of Polish and Czech and Serbian, and it all gets mixed up. The only problem is that the words mean something different in each language. So there was a Czech general who went to Moscow after the war, and he wanted to tell them that they had a beautiful life. And he said, "У вас есть красный живот," which in Russian means you have a red stomach. So I could use some help in making sure that I use the right words. I really do. My brooches and pins have been an awful lot of fun. And I do have a Russian story that goes with that, which is when I became Secretary of State, the department was being bugged by the Russians. We found the guy, he was sitting outside. And we did what diplomats do, which is demarche Moscow. But the next time I was with Foreign Minister Primakov, I wore a huge bug, and he knew exactly what message I was sending. So today I'm wearing a Statue of Liberty, which I really do think is very appropriate. And I, in many ways, would probably wear a combination of pins to meet President Biden. I do think that he is very proud of America and what we can do. And I would wear an eagle, but I would also wear a dove because of his understanding of the importance of peace and humility. And that combination of wanting America to be what it has to be, but understanding that there is humility. And I might wear a bridge, actually. I have all three. I hope I'll have a chance to wear all three. But he is a really remarkable person to be our president at this very, very complicated time.
So we have a comment from Sue Bruce, who's with us from Scotland, and she says that the UK government and Scotland are very open to immigration, that Scotland needs immigrants to enable our society and economy to flourish. It's good to know that there are other immigrant societies. The UK is one. Canada is definitely another that we can emulate as well. Klaus Bitter. Klaus. Hey, Klaus, you might be on mute.
I'm sorry, I have difficulties with my connection.
It's okay.
Okay. I'm very proud. I've been a student of Cambridge and Harvard University too. And so I think it's more than correct to be that the Americans are proud of the Americans. But just right now we face something like 20 million refugees worldwide. So my question to all of you, especially if you allow to Madeleine Albright, of course, is how is it possible for all of us to solve this worldwide and global crisis we have to face besides climate change and besides COVID, 20 million refugees just right now and this year, and we can only solve it globally. Thank you.
I think that we do need to solve it globally, because while I believe that when I used to be able to travel, the US is a very large country and we have an awful lot of room. And there are now issues about filling a variety of different jobs. But I also think that other countries need to play their part, that there needs to be some way that there's an understanding that refugees and immigrants can add to the prosperity of countries. And there are an awful lot of countries that have aging populations that actually need young people from a variety of other countries. And there has to be some kind of a system that works better. The European Union, if I may say so, has to have some way of figuring it out. I think also the United Nations, which does have a refugee operation, and with the current Secretary General who has experience in all of this, I think that there needs to be an international approach to it. And it's when, in fact, X country, whichever one it is, feels that they are the only ones with the responsibility, I think that makes it more difficult. I have to say, I was kind of surprised to find out in many ways how the European system, with the initial refugees that were coming out of the Middle East, with the various things that were going on, and the people in boats, that there was no really computer system to figure out who was who. It was very strange, very kind of lack of modern facilities to deal with what is an old but also a modern problem. And it has to be done internationally.
I just would add to what Madeleine has said. Madeleine and Dina and I have a good friend named David Miliband, former UK Foreign Secretary, now president of the International Rescue Committee in New York. It's our largest refugee organization. He'll tell you that there are about 80 million refugees and internally displaced people in the world today. It's the highest number since the summer of 1945. And when the largest country in the international system, the most powerful and wealthiest under the Trump administration, tried to cut refugee admittance down to 0 some months, literally not taking anyone in, you can imagine that just compounds the crisis. So I think it's very positive that President Biden has responded with his call for us to raise that to 63,500 in this year. I hope the Congress will respond. And it's part of our national responsibility. I can just name 3 refugees, whom all of you remember. Albert Einstein was a refugee to the United States, Henry Kissinger, whose portrait is in President Bush's book, and Madeleine Albright. And that's just a reminder of how important this is. We'll have 2 more questions from 2 of my great students. Jose Luis de Colmenares is more than a student. He is a Spanish diplomat who's with us for a year as a fellow. And Gadir Kuna is a great student. And I had the pleasure of having Gadir as one of the students in my class, Great Power. So why don't you both ask your questions, maybe just back to back, and then I'll ask Ezinne and Dina and Madeleine to respond to them. Jose Luis.
Great. Thank you very much for this very moving and fascinating presentation. I'm really so happy to have joined it and listen to these wonderful stories that fill me with hope and optimism. As a European and as a Spanish diplomat, I have been confronted many times with difficult and complicated procedures for people trying to emigrate legally and lawfully to Europe. And yet, I can see these waves of immigration trying to cross the Mediterranean or the Atlantic into the Canaries. Upwards of 40% of the people attempting to cross the Mediterranean or the Atlantic never make it, which is a tragedy that is not often mentioned. Is there something that is, in your opinion, flawed in our immigration policies? Are we very strict in our policies? Should we be more open, in addition to fighting human traffickers more strongly? Should we take a more open attitude towards the procedures at our consulates in order to get people in and help some of these people come legally into Europe, or the States for that matter? And in addition to this, and if I may, what do you make of European leaders who make reference to anti-immigration policies, who speak about homogeneity, who decry multicultural tendencies as the future of our societies.
Jose Luis, thank you. We'll come back to that after we hear Gadir's question. I would just say that phenomenon of anti-democratic populism, anti-migrant, that's present in the United States too. We saw it in the last administration. Gadir, please, welcome.
Hello, Professor. It's so good to see you. And Ezinne, mabruk, congratulations. My question is this. As an immigrant myself to the United States one of the things that I was hoping that we would be able to achieve is, even though more countries are opening up their boundaries and taking in immigrants in their countries, there is no denying that there is a rise in populist movements and in authoritarian regimes around the world. One of the reasons, I was hoping is, what can we do as nations to stem those immigration, but by making their countries livable themselves? And yet, with what we're seeing, Liz Cheney just got ousted for standing up against the big lie. When a nation like the United States, that is the beacon of freedom and hope, with all the type of internal turbulences we're having, what is it that you think we can do to kind of like still be who we are and what we stand for? And yet, one of the things besides just taking in immigrants is making them not in the position that they have to flee their own countries. A lot of them wouldn't want to. If they were able to, they would want to stay and live in still with their country, in their countries with their people. What would you recommend?
So two good questions, and we'll end on these two questions. And I would just ask Madeleine, Ezinne, Dina, whatever you'd like to say in conclusion about today's event, about your experience as an immigrant or a refugee. Both of these questions from Jose and Luis and Gadir, they have a common denominator. What is at the root of the forces that are producing refugees and immigration? You see Vice President Harris trying to lead our effort, Gadir, to do exactly what you just said, try to make life better in parts of Central America so that people won't feel the need to flee to the United States. Jose Luis asked the question about this problem of Libyan and Syrian and other refugees coming across the Mediterranean Sea into Spain, France, Italy, and Greece. So Madeleine, I don't know if you have views on this, Ezinne, Dina, whoever would like to take a swing at that question of policy, but then I'd ask all of you maybe just to make some concluding remarks about the major focus of today's event, and that is, can America redeem itself and become again the immigrant and refugee accepting nation that we should be, and that honors our traditions? That's our challenge. Madeleine?
Well, I think these two questions and your what you're saying about concluding events goes basically to the crisis of our time. The question is how we got here. I did write a book. It was called Fascism, A Warning. And it basically went to trying to figure out what has happened in terms of how authoritarian governments have gotten power, mainly because they have appealed to this kind of division, to the supremacy of homogeneity in some way. And I think that we are at a really critical point in terms of what the world in the 21st century is going to look like. People do have the capability, when there's not a lockdown because of COVID, of being movable. Globalization has allowed people to kind of get around, and technology has made that easier. And at the same time, it has created a real question about how democratic governments are supposed to operate. And what has happened is there are divisions in every society. And when you find a leader that is willing to exacerbate those divisions, I think that is when we run into problems. Mussolini was the first fascist. And I think that the issue really was that he was able to figure out how to work off of anger by the Italian people that had not been recognized properly for their participation in World War I, and also divisions in society due to economic issues. And a demagogic leader knows how to exacerbate those divisions by identifying one group and making the other group the scapegoat. And that is what is going on in a number of countries. I think we have to be aware of what is going on, that there is an undermining of the kind of system. I do think that we need to be honest with ourselves in terms of what has happened and recognize that in order to exist in the 21st century with technology and information and any number of different things, that we are all stronger if we open up our borders and recognize that people want to be in different places, that is the basis. At the same time, I think that we need to understand that for the most part, people would prefer to live in the country where they were born, family, language, etc., if they could make a living and if they were not frightened. And therefore, and this is one of the hardest parts, is for the rich countries, developed countries, to understand that we can't live isolated, and that some of the funds and various things that we have can in fact be shared with others. And the hardest part, and this is true for every country, is how to make domestic and foreign policy understandable to each other so that people don't think that they're giving away something to a bunch of people they've never heard of, whereas we all benefit, in fact, by having an open societies. But we are at a very, very key point, and we can't afford to have leaders who identify themselves with one group at the expense of another. The best quote in my book, that book, came from Mussolini. If you pluck a chicken one feather at a time, nobody notices. And there have been a lot of feather plucking going on. And we don't want a bald chicken, but we also have to try to figure out how to help grow feathers back, how to, in fact, build and try to find what the root of the problems are and be honest with each other. It is that lack of honesty that I think is the problem. And I hope that that is what this particular discussion, Nick, which I've been honored to be a part of, is to really be able to tell the truth and to talk about what the countries are about and to try to answer the questions and to know that they're not easy to answer, and that we all have a responsibility to each other to try to sort out what are the major issues of the 21st century. Other than that, there's nothing to talk about. And I'm honored to have been a part of this. Thank you.
And we've been honored to have you with us, Madam Secretary. Thank you very, very much for giving us your time. Let me ask Dina and Ezinne to offer any concluding remarks that they'd like to.
Well, thank you, Nick. And I'm also very, very honored. And thank you all so much for joining us today. I even have my in-laws, Jim and Marianne McCormick, and our family friend, Janice Fitzgerald on. That's a huge honor for me. You know, I want to say something, especially to Gadir. You know, I'm long America. I'm long on the United States. We are an exceptional country. We are a young country that has achieved more than any other country I can think of in the world. And I just want us to always remember that, because as we are continuing on what Secretary Rice always calls that more perfect union, we can't ever lose sight of that. And Jose Luis, I agree with you. You know, I was right before COVID in Europe, and I remember just thinking, being an immigrant in Europe is a very different thing than being an immigrant in the United States. There is nowhere near the level of acceptance or appreciation or integration. So let's all just remember how lucky we are. And I also think that just the fact that we can have the debates that we're having publicly, that we can go through these enormously challenging times and come out the other side, is really, really what also distinguishes us. And so I believe in that. I believe that we also are still the country that so many people want to come to and participate in a meaningful way. I am so impressed with Ezinne, and I just want to kind of close by saying to you, you're really an inspiration to our daughters. And so thank you for all that you're doing. And I really want to say that without people like Secretary Carter and Ambassador Burns, you don't get the Ezinnes of the world. And so I want to say you are terrific mentors. You are what we call the few good men. There's lots of good men, but great men behind extraordinary women. And we're very proud of you. And I was always so proud to work with you, Ambassador Burns. And thank you for having me today.
Dina, thank you very, very much. And thank you for everything you're doing for our country as well, and have done in the past and will do in the future. Ezinne, that leaves you. I just want to say again, I'll say it for a third time, we're proud of you. Congratulations on achieving your master's degree from the Harvard Kennedy School, to add to your academic distinctions, and all the best at the White House. Your concluding comments, please.
Thank you, Ambassador Burns and Secretary Carter, for hosting this at the Belfer Center and for having us here. It is an honor to share the stage with Secretary Albright and with Dina. And it's a delight, Dina, that your children are inspired by my work. And I would just echo what has been said, that everywhere you go in this world, you can spot an American because they are optimistic. And a lot of people want a drop of the elixir that we have here in the US. So I feel very lucky to have migrated and thrived here. And I will leave you all with this. I do believe in the US and in the American dream, because what it is to me is it's not anything physical. It's the right to dream of what you want to make of your life and for your life and work towards it. And there's a bit of that that's glorious. If your dreams change because you become wiser or have acquired more knowledge, that's okay too. You are accepted, you are encouraged like I have been, and you are supported. And I think that that's a gift we receive as Americans every day. Thank you.
Nick, could I say one more word? I really do think this has been remarkable in so many different ways. And I'm looking forward to greeting Ezinne in Washington, because she is the hope of the future in so many ways. And the fact that she is in this book that President Bush painted, and has really decided what she's going to do to make the world better. I just am blown away by her and her possibilities and what it means for the next generation. And I'm delighted to be on again with my good friend Dina and all of you. This has been remarkable. Thank you so much for including me.
Thank you, Madeleine. You know, as a fellow professor, that our students give us hope when we see the optimism that they have and the brilliance that they have, and they go into public service. So I agree with you. I want to thank everybody for being here today. And I want to thank you for the quality of your comments. I want to thank Mr. and Mrs. McCormick. I'm an admirer of your son and a friend of your son, so thank you for being here. We wanted to have a conversation about immigration and refugees because we think, I certainly believe very strongly, as many of us do here at Harvard, it's part of the mission of the country, the ethic of the country, the mandate of the country of America to be open, to be welcoming, and to conceive of ourselves as multi-religious, multiracial, multi-ethnic. It's vital for our future too, because if we're going to be economically successful and continue to be a young nation, we need immigration and refugees to add to this country's strength. So we also wanted to pay tribute to President George W. Bush. He's written this remarkable book out of many won portraits of 43 immigrants from 35 countries. And I definitely wanted to pay tribute to Ezinne, Dina, and Secretary Madeleine Albright for the example of their lives and everything that you've given our country. So thank you to the three of you. Thanks everyone for being with us. Erica Meniselis, thank you for organizing this. Have a nice day. Thank you.